In the waning months of World War II, as Nazi Germany crumbled under the relentless advance of Allied forces, rumors began to circulate among intelligence operatives about something so extraordinary, so fundamentally impossible, that many would spend the rest of their lives trying to prove it actually existed. A device called Die Glocke, the bell, a machine that witnesses claim defied the laws of physics itself, a cylindrical object made of a mysterious metal alloy, spinning at incomprehensible speeds, surrounded by an electromagnetic field so powerful it could lift objects from the earth, tear apart the very fabric of reality, or worse, unlock secrets to technology that humanity was not yet ready to possess. But here's the thing that makes this story so compelling, so utterly captivating, that it has spawned countless books, documentaries, conspiracy theories, and debates that rage on to this very day. We still don't know if it really existed at all. Welcome to the story of Die Glocke, a mystery that sits at the intersection of history, science fiction, and our desperate human desire to believe that the impossible might actually be possible. The year is 1944, and deep within the mountains of Lower Silesia, in what is now Poland, a secret Nazi research facility codenamed Der Flugel, the wing, is humming with clandestine activity. Scientists, engineers, and military personnel work around the clock on various experimental projects, some of which would remain classified for decades after the war's end. Among these projects, whispered about in hushed tones, referenced only in fragmentary documents that would later be discovered by Allied intelligence services, was something called Die Glocke. The first real evidence that this device existed came not from Nazi archives or official documents, but from the testimony of a single man, a man who would become the primary source for everything we think we know about this legendary machine. His name was Igor Witkowski, a police journalist and researcher who, in the 1990s, claimed to have interviewed several individuals who had worked at these secret Nazi facilities during the final years of the war. According to Witkowski's account, Die Glocke was cylindrical in shape, approximately 9 meters in diameter and 20 meters in height, constructed from a material that witnesses described as a metallic substance of unknown composition. What made Die Glocke truly extraordinary, however, was not its appearance but its alleged function. According to the testimony Witkowski gathered, the device operated by spinning two counter-rotating cylinders at extremely high speeds, creating a rotating plasma field that was said to have properties that defied conventional physics. The witnesses claimed that when the device was activated, it generated a powerful electromagnetic field, and that this field could do things that seemed to belong more to the realm of science fiction than to historical reality. It could allegedly levitate objects, create gravitational distortions, and in some accounts, open tears in the space-time continuum itself. Now, before we go any further, we need to understand the context in which these claims were made. By the 1990s, when Witkowski began his investigation, the Cold War was over, and there was an enormous appetite in Western culture for stories about lost Nazi superweapons. The popularity of films like Indiana Jones had created a romanticized narrative around Nazi secret technology, and the public imagination was primed to believe that Hitler's Germany had possessed far more advanced technology than historians had previously acknowledged. This cultural moment is crucial because it reminds us that the story of Die Glocke is not just a story about a machine, it's a story about how history gets interpreted, how evidence gets weighed, how myth and reality become intertwined in ways that can be almost impossible to untangle. The alleged specifications of Die Glocke, as described by Witkowski's sources, read like something from a physics textbook written by someone who had read a lot of science fiction. The device supposedly used a mercury-based plasma or some kind of exotic matter to create its effects, and the energy required to operate it would have been enormous, perhaps requiring an entire power station dedicated solely to keeping the machine functioning. Some accounts suggested that the device could only be activated for brief periods because the electromagnetic radiation it produced was so intense that it was lethal to anything in its immediate vicinity. Other testimonies mentioned that during test runs, the area around the facility experienced strange phenomena: animals behaving irrationally, plants growing in unusual ways, even reports of temporal distortions where time seemed to move differently in certain zones around the device. These accounts, while certainly dramatic, begin to strain credulity, and this is where the scientific skepticism enters the story. When physicists and engineers have examined the claims about Die Glocke, they have found numerous problems with the alleged specifications. The idea of creating a rotating plasma field that could somehow manipulate gravity or open tears in space-time is not supported by any known physics. Relativity, quantum mechanics, electromagnetism, none of these well-established frameworks suggest that such a device could function in the way it was described. Moreover, the power requirements to generate such effects would be staggeringly beyond what Nazi Germany could have mustered in the final years of the war, when the nation was already struggling to maintain basic infrastructure and supply its military forces with fundamental equipment. Yet, despite these scientific objections, the legend of the Glock has persisted, and it has done so because it taps into something deeper in the human imagination. The notion that there are secrets hidden from us, that governments and powers have access to technologies we don't fully understand, and that the boundary between the impossible and the possible might be far more permeable than we'd like to believe. To understand Die Glocke in its proper historical context, we need to step back and look at the actual secret weapon programs that Nazi Germany was pursuing in the final years of the war. The Nazis were indeed conducting research into advanced technologies, and some of these programs were remarkably sophisticated. The V 1 flying bomb and the V 2 rocket represent the most famous examples, but there were many others. Jet fighters like the Messerschmitt Me 262, supersonic aircraft designs, research into nuclear weapons, and numerous other experimental weapon systems. Some of these programs were genuinely ahead of their time in certain respects, and the Allies were genuinely concerned about what the Nazis might be developing. This legitimate basis for concern about Nazi secret weapons provided fertile ground for speculation, and as the war wound down, and Allied forces began to overrun Nazi territory, soldiers and intelligence operatives encountered numerous incomplete or abandoned research facilities. Many of these contained evidence of exotic experiments and unusual engineering, and the fragmentary nature of this evidence allowed for considerable speculation about what had actually been achieved and what had merely been theoretical research. It was in this context that stories about machines that could do the impossible began to circulate. Some of these stories were probably exaggerations or misunderstandings of actual projects, while others may have been complete fabrications, perhaps invented by researchers hoping to secure positions in the post-war world by claiming to have knowledge of secret Nazi technologies. The specific story of Die Glocke gained more traction when, in the 1950s, researchers began to encounter references to a project called Kronos, or references to a facility where advanced electromagnetic research was being conducted. These fragmentary references in declassified documents, combined with the testimony of various individuals who claimed to have knowledge of the device, created a narrative that seemed to have at least some basis in the historical record. What's fascinating about the Die Glocke phenomenon is how it demonstrates the way that history and mythology can become deeply intertwined. The device has been mentioned in numerous books about Nazi secret weapons, has been the subject of lengthy documentaries, and has spawned an entire subgenre of speculative fiction that imagines what might have happened if the Nazis had actually succeeded in completing this device and had somehow managed to deploy it. Some versions of this story claim that the device was so dangerous that it was never fully tested, while others suggest that successful tests were conducted but that the results were so catastrophic that the entire project was immediately abandoned and buried under layers of secrecy. One particularly creative version of the dialogue story claims that the device was never intended as a weapon at all, but rather as a time machine or a device for creating controlled wormholes. This version of the story has found its way into numerous science fiction novels and has become almost as famous as the original story about the electromagnetic weapon. The problem with all of these variations is that the evidence for dialogue is incredibly thin. While there are references in some declassified documents to various secret weapons programs, there is no definitive proof that Die Glocke ever actually existed. The primary source remains Igor Witkowski's interviews from the 1990s, and while Witkowski is generally regarded as a serious researcher, the fact that his sources remain largely anonymous and that their testimony cannot be independently verified creates significant problems for historians trying to assess the validity of these claims. Moreover, when we look at the actual capabilities and resources of Nazi Germany in the final years of the war, we have to ask some hard questions about whether a project of the scale and sophistication attributed to Die Glocke could have actually been conducted. By 1944 and 1945, the Nazi war machine was being strangled by resource shortages, and the scientific and engineering talent that the regime had once commanded was being depleted by the draft and by emigration. The idea that enormous resources could have been devoted to a secret project of the ambition of Die Glocke becomes increasingly difficult to sustain when we consider what we know about the actual state of the Nazi war effort during this period. Furthermore, if such a device had been successfully created and tested, we would expect to find more substantial evidence of its existence. The Manhattan Project, the Allies' atomic bomb program, involved tens of thousands of people and vast resources, and while it was kept secret during the war, its existence became known relatively quickly after the conflict ended, and the evidence for it is overwhelming. If Die Glocke was real, and if it was being tested and deployed, we would expect to find similar evidence: physical artifacts, more extensive documentation, testimony from more sources, something that would constitute a more solid historical foundation than what we currently possess. The legend of Die Glocke also tells us something important about how we construct narratives about the past. We have a strong psychological need to believe that there are mysteries, that history is more dramatic and stranger than what appears in textbooks, and that there may be secrets being kept from us. This need creates what we might call a credibility gap, where evidence that would normally be considered insufficient to support a historical claim becomes acceptable because it fits into a narrative that feels true, even if it may not actually be true. The Die Glocke story also emerged at a particular moment in history when Western culture was becoming increasingly fascinated with the idea of lost civilizations and lost technologies. Ancient astronaut theories, pseudo archaeological claims, and alternative history narratives were gaining popularity, and Die Glocke fit naturally into this broader ecosystem of alternative history narratives. It suggested that there were technological secrets lost in the chaos of World War II, that governments were hiding knowledge about advanced technologies, and that the true history of the 20th century was far stranger and more wondrous than what we were being told. Now, let's examine what we actually know about Nazi electromagnetic research, because to understand Die Glocke, we need to separate the legend from what the Nazis were actually pursuing in this field. Nazi Germany did conduct research into electromagnetism and exotic materials. One researcher of particular note was Victor Schauberger, an Austrian engineer and inventor who conducted experiments with vortex technology and claimed to have developed propulsion systems based on principles he had derived from observing natural phenomena. Schauberger's work was certainly unconventional and ahead of its time in some respects, and his research did attract the attention of Nazi scientists and military officials. However, while Schauberger's ideas were genuinely innovative, they did not produce practical results that could be deployed as weapons or revolutionary technologies during the war. The Nazis were also researching various forms of energy and propulsion, and some of this research did produce interesting theoretical frameworks. However, there's a crucial difference between having interesting theoretical ideas and having a working device that can manipulate gravity or create wormholes. The latter requires not just theoretical knowledge but also the ability to engineer it into a functional machine, and the evidence that the Nazis achieved this simply does not exist. Another key piece of context for understanding Die Glocke is to look at what happened to Nazi scientists after the war. During Operation Paperclip and other similar programs, the Allies recruited hundreds of Nazi scientists and engineers to work on military and scientific projects in the United States and the Soviet Union. If Nazi Germany had possessed technology of the revolutionary sort attributed to Die Glocke, we would expect that the Allies would have found evidence of this and would have incorporated it into their own research programs. While there were certainly Nazi technologies that proved interesting to the Allies, jet engines, rocket technology, and certain military designs, there is no evidence that any acquired Die Glocke or its blueprints, or that any serious attempt was made to reconstruct such a device based on Nazi research. The absence of such evidence is significant, and it suggests that either Die Glocke did not exist, or that if it did, it existed only as theoretical research that never progressed to the stage of an actual working prototype. Let's consider another angle on this mystery, the possibility that Die Glocke was not a Nazi project at all, or at least not primarily a Nazi project. Some researchers have speculated that various secret societies or esoteric groups may have been involved in the research that gave rise to the Die Glocke legend. This conspiracy theory draws on the long history of legends about secret knowledge held by hidden groups, and it ties into broader narratives about the occult interest of certain Nazi leaders. While it's true that some Nazi elites were interested in esoteric philosophies and occult traditions, there is no reliable evidence that these interests translated into the development of revolutionary technologies. The Die Glocke story, when examined closely, reveals itself to be a mixture of fragmented historical facts, speculative interpretation, wishful thinking, and probably a fair amount of deliberate fabrication or exaggeration. But this doesn't mean the story is without value or interest. In fact, the Die Glocke phenomenon tells us a great deal about how modern mythology develops, about the way that historical evidence is interpreted and reinterpreted, and about the human desire to believe that there are secrets hidden from us. The Die Glocke story also connects to broader questions about technological progress and the nature of scientific discovery. Throughout history, technologies that seemed impossible according to the physics of the time have occasionally been achieved through engineering breakthroughs or new theoretical frameworks. The idea of heavier than air flight seemed impossible until the Wright brothers achieved it. Nuclear energy seemed like science fiction until Einstein's theories made it theoretically plausible and physicists demonstrated it was actually achievable. This history of seemingly impossible technologies eventually becoming possible creates a kind of argument in favor of the possibility of Die Glocke. Maybe the argument goes, the physics that would support such a device hasn't been discovered yet. Or maybe the device operated according to principles that we still don't fully understand. However, this argument, while superficially appealing, doesn't actually hold up under scrutiny. The difference between technologies that seemed impossible but turned out to be possible and completely mythical technologies is that the former are always grounded in theoretical frameworks that can be tested and examined. When Einstein proposed that matter and energy were equivalent through E equals mc/2, this wasn't just an interesting idea. It was a mathematical framework that made testable predictions and that could be examined by the scientific community. The claims about Die Glocke, by contrast, are not grounded in any coherent theoretical framework. They don't make specific testable predictions. Instead, they rely on vague references to concepts like plasma fields and electromagnetic distortions that sound scientific but that don't add up to an actual physics of how such a device would work. Let's also consider the question of motivation. Why would we want Die Glocke to be real? What psychological need does the belief in Die Glocke fulfill? I would suggest that part of the appeal of the Die Glocke story is that it suggests that the boundaries of what's possible are far wider than we believe them to be. It offers a kind of hope that humanity might be capable of achieving things that currently seem impossible, that there might be technological frontiers we haven't yet discovered. This is not a bad impulse. The history of science and technology is full of examples of things that seemed impossible becoming possible. However, there's a danger in conflating hope with evidence and in accepting stories about the impossible without demanding the kind of rigorous evidence we would require for more mundane historical claims. The Die Glocke story also points to something important about the nature of historical investigation. History is not a completed discipline with all the answers already known. There are genuine mysteries in history, questions that cannot be definitely answered with the evidence currently available. However, there is a difference between genuine historical mysteries and stories that lack adequate evidence to be believed. A genuine historical mystery is one where we have credible evidence suggesting something happened, but we don't have all the details. The disappearance of the princess in the tower, for example, is a genuine historical mystery. We have evidence that they were in the Tower of London, evidence that they disappeared, evidence of various theories about what might have happened to them, but we don't have definitive proof of exactly what occurred. Die Glocke, by contrast, is not really a historical mystery in this sense. Rather, it's a story that lacks adequate evidence to be accepted as historical fact, but that has become culturally popular enough that people assume it must have some basis in historical reality. Now let's address what might be the most important question about Die Glocke. Even if we can't say with certainty that it didn't exist, what can we say about the probability of its existence based on the evidence we have? Historians and scientists generally use a principle called extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The claim that Nazi Germany developed a device that could manipulate gravity or create wormholes is certainly extraordinary. It would represent a revolutionary breakthrough in physics and engineering, something that has never been achieved before or since, something that would overturn many of our fundamental assumptions about how the universe works. For such an extraordinary claim, we would need extraordinary evidence, not just testimony from anonymous sources interviewed decades after the war, but physical artifacts, contemporary documentation, multiple independent sources, and most importantly, a coherent theoretical framework that explains how such a device could actually work. The Die Glocke story fails to provide any of these forms of evidence at a convincing level. When we apply the standards of historical evidence that scholars and scientists normally use, the case for Die Glocke becomes very weak indeed. And yet, the story persists, has been retold countless times, has inspired books and documentaries and fiction, and has become embedded in our culture as a kind of modern myth. This persistence tells us something important about human nature and about how we relate to history. We want history to be dramatic, to contain mysteries and wonders, to suggest that there are depths to reality that we haven't fully plumbed. The Die Glocke story appeals to this desire, and that appeal is strong enough to sustain belief in the story even when the evidence for it is weak. The story of Die Glocke also reminds us that in the modern era, with the internet and the ability to spread information instantly across the globe, myths can develop and persist with remarkable speed. A story that would have remained a local legend or a footnote in a historical archive can now become a global phenomenon, shared and reshared, embedded in popular culture until it achieves a kind of cultural reality that is independent of whether it has any basis in historical fact. This democratization of narrative, the ability of anyone to tell a story and have it reach a massive audience, has many positive aspects. But it also means that false or unverified claims can spread and take root in ways that would have been impossible in earlier eras. Looking at the Die Glocke phenomenon as a whole, we can see it as emblematic of a broader transformation in how modern societies relate to knowledge, evidence, and truth. In an age where we have unprecedented access to information, we also have unprecedented difficulty in distinguishing reliable information from unreliable information. The Die Glocke story thrives in this environment because it has enough surface plausibility. It's based on real historical events, real secret weapons programs, real Nazi research that it can seem credible to people who don't have deep expertise in the relevant fields. At the same time, it offers just enough mystery and wonder to capture the imagination and sustain belief despite weak evidence. In conclusion, the most honest thing we can say about Die Glocke is that we simply don't know if it existed or not. The evidence for its existence is thin, circumstantial, and difficult to verify. The claims made about its capabilities are not supported by known physics and seem unlikely given what we understand about Nazi Germany's resources and capabilities in the final years of the war. However, the absence of definitive proof is not the same as definitive proof of absence. It's possible that Die Glocke was a real project that remains hidden or was destroyed, leaving only fragmentary traces. It's possible that some of the legends about it are based on real experiments that have been exaggerated and mythologized over time. But based on the evidence we currently have, the most rational conclusion is that Die Glocke, if it existed at all, was probably not the revolutionary device that legend suggests. More likely, it was either a theoretical research program that never produced practical results, or a piece of Nazi equipment or experiment that has been significantly misunderstood and exaggerated in the decades since the war. The Die Glocke story is ultimately a story about mystery, about the limits of historical knowledge, and about the human desire to believe that there are secrets hidden from us, that reality is stranger and more wonderful than we typically acknowledge. In that sense, whether or not Die Glocke actually existed becomes almost beside the point. The story serves a cultural function, satisfying our curiosity about hidden knowledge and our desire to believe that there are boundaries to scientific understanding that have yet to be breached. It reminds us that history is not a closed book, that there are still mysteries to investigate, and that the past may hold secrets we have yet to discover. However, it also reminds us of the importance of evidence, of the need to apply critical thinking to claims that sound extraordinary, and of the danger of allowing myth and desire to overwhelm our commitment to truth and accuracy. The Die Glocke phenomenon is thus a fascinating case study in modern mythology, in how historical narratives develop and spread, and in the eternal human tension between what we know and what we wish to believe. And that, ultimately, is the real story here, not whether a mysterious machine called Die Glocke actually existed, but rather why we so desperately want it to have existed, and what that desire tells us about ourselves and our relationship with history, science, and the possibility of the impossible. How did you like this exploration into one of history's most enduring mysteries? There are so many layers to this story: the historical context, the scientific skepticism, the cultural factors that keep the legend alive, and I hope you found it as fascinating as I do. If you have your own thoughts about Die Glocke, if you've read something about it that you found compelling, or if you have a different perspective on how we should evaluate this kind of historical claims, please let me know in the comments below. I really do read them and I love hearing what you think. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.